They laughed when he bid on the wreck, until it started, and the past came howling out like thunder from a grave. The girl thought she was just an assistant, until she saw her mother's name scratched beneath the dashboard in faded ink. The truck wasn't just old, it was sacred, and when he turned the key, it brought back more than just noise. A soldier's dog returned from nowhere, and led them down a road none of them remembered, but all of them needed. She asked why the truck mattered, and he handed her a photo that made her knees buckle on the spot. Leah, the young auction assistant who had never met her father, couldn't yet know that the rusted truck Henry bid on once belonged to a fallen soldier with her mother's name in his final letter. Tom, the mechanic who lost his brother in the same war, had no idea that by helping Henry, he was stepping into the heart of his own unfinished story. And Henry, a grieving father carrying 20 years of silence, certainly had no idea that the girl holding the clipboard beside him was the living echo of the son he lost and the granddaughter he never knew he had. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the kind of morning that makes an old man pause on his porch steps just to feel it settle into his bones, clear sky stretching wide over Ridgeview, the crisp kind of silence you only get before the day begins rustling to life, and that faint scent of dry dust hanging in the air like the memory of something almost forgotten. The gravel crunched under heavy boots as a line of early risers made their slow pilgrimage toward the old auction yard. Some were mechanics with grease already under their nails, some wore worn leather jackets that hadn't fit right since '82, and others still, sharp-eyed and silent, were there for one reason only, the hunt for a forgotten prize, buried beneath rust and rain stains. Among them moved a figure that didn't quite belong to the present, stooped with time, leaning ever so slightly to the right like the old oak on Darby Lane that had weathered too many storms. His name, though few knew it that morning, was Henry Sewell. And he walked not with urgency, but with a kind of reverence, like a man who'd been here before, long ago, when the world felt a little larger and the road ahead didn't end so near. His cap, once dark blue, now faded to the color of dried denim, sat low over his brow, casting a shadow over the kind of eyes that had seen too much war and too many winters. But in that moment, they weren't looking for profit, not even nostalgia, no. Henry was searching for something far more elusive, something that couldn't be bargained over the hum of an auctioneer's voice. They say the past has a peculiar way of finding you when you're not quite ready, not in dreams or memories, but in places that smell of oil and dust, in the familiar creak of a gate you hadn't opened in 50 years, or in the glint of sun off a cracked windshield half buried behind weeds and time. The crowd moved toward the Glossios side of the yard, red Mustangs lined up like parade queens, engines polished and spotless like they'd never seen a dirt road, and folks pressed close, eyes wide, hands ready, but Henry veered off, unnoticed, slipping between rows like a man following a scent, something only he could feel pulling him forward. Then he stopped. In the far corner of the lot, beyond the last Camaro and past a stack of rusted signs leaning on one another like drunks, stood a pickup that didn't so much shimmer as sigh under the morning sun, a 1950s Ford F-100. Gray-blue once, but now weathered to the color of regret, its body kissed with rust in all the right places, and the left headlight socket empty like an old man missing a tooth. Henry didn't approach it fast. He just stood there a long while, hands in his coat pockets, as if he needed a moment to make peace with the past before reaching out to touch it again. Then, slow and careful like opening a long-sealed envelope, he stepped closer, reached for the door handle, and with a gentle nudge, as if asking permission, pulled it open. It groaned, of course, as all doors from that era do, but to Henry, it sounded more like a welcome home than a complaint. Behind him, the auctioneer's voice echoed across the lot, lively, practiced, hungry for bids, but Henry didn't look back. Instead, he reached into the cab and ran his fingers across the cracked leather of the bench seat, brushing away just like clearing years off a face he once knew. He murmured something then, something low, like a name or a promise, and just as he turned to examine the rust pattern on the fender, a voice behind him broke the moment. A young woman, clipboard in hand, hair tied back like she meant business, asked the kind of question most folks don't expect to matter. "Sir, are you sure you're looking at the right truck?" Henry didn't turn around right away when the young woman asked if he was looking at the right truck. Instead, he kept his hand resting on the weathered edge of the driver's door, as if grounding himself in something far more permanent than polished chrome or fleeting memories. Then he spoke, slowly, with the kind of deliberate pause between words that comes only when each syllable is chosen for weight, not effect. And when he did, his voice carried the gravel of time and the quiet thunder of a man who has lived more years than he expected. "I'm not looking for the right truck, young lady," he said, turning his head just enough to meet her eyes. "I'm looking for the one that remembers me." There was a moment, the kind you could almost feel stretching in the air, when she didn't know whether to smile or step back, because what he said didn't quite make sense, not to someone who lived in a world of VIN numbers and Kelly Blue Book estimates. But it made all the sense in the world to a man who'd once built his life inside the cab of something just like this. Henry finally turned fully to face her, not with defiance, not with pride, but with that calm steadiness older men sometimes carry, like the stillness of a lake just before a storm, and when he looked at her, something in her posture softened, just slightly. She glanced back at the truck, maybe for the first time seeing not just rust and dents, but a story trying to push its way back through the years, and without realizing it, she stepped closer, drawn not by the truck, but by the gravity of the man beside it. He tapped the hood lightly, twice, the way you might knock on a familiar door, and then, with the kind of grin that barely lifted the corners of his mouth, he said, "Funny thing about old machines. They don't forget the hands that built them, or the ones that bled just to keep them running." The young woman, her name tag read Leah, though it was half covered by the flap of her clipboard, looked down, then up again, and asked gently, Did you used to have one like it?" Henry didn't answer with words, not right away. He stepped around to the back of the truck, the soles of his boots moving slow and certain over the cracked pavement, until he reached the tailgate, where a faint imprint of letters still clung to the metal like dried tears on an old photograph. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, not a wallet, not keys, but a photograph, yellowed and soft around the edges, the kind you don't carry for show but for memory. He didn't hand it to her, just looked at it, long and slow, before returning it to his pocket without a word. "Then, I still on the truck," he said. "There was a time, miss, when this kind of rig wasn't just transportation, it was a lifeline, a shelter, a witness to everything a man couldn't say out loud." Leah, now quieter, almost reverent, lowered her clipboard, suddenly aware that this wasn't going to be just another auction story about a stubborn old-timer and a rust bucket. And just then, as if the morning had been waiting for it, the loudspeaker cracked to life, the auctioneer's voice cutting through the air like a carnival barker on too much coffee, calling out, "Lot 87 coming up, Ford F-100, she's a beauty if you like." In bold. Henry didn't flinch, didn't shift his stance, didn't second-guess. He reached into his coat pocket again, not for a photo this time, but for a small, square paddle with a number in faded red ink, 27. He raised it high, arm steady, eyes on the truck, and the air went still for a heartbeat too long. "Do I hear a bid?" the auctioneer called, scanning the crowd already drifting back toward the center ring of chrome and gloss, before spotting the single hand in the air. "We've got 27 on lot 87. Do I hear 30? But there was no 30, no 40, no anything. Just silence. And then, almost too quickly, the final hammer came down, loud and certain, like a judge's gavel sealing the fate of a man on trial. "Sold. Lot 87 goes for $200, and that's a steal, folks." Heads turned. Eyes blinked. A few whispers snuck through the crowd like mice through a corn bin. Who the hell wants that thing? Why? What for? But Henry said nothing. He didn't need to, because he wasn't there for questions. He was there for answers. And as he turned from the crowd, ticket in hand, heading toward the office trailer to sign whatever needed signing, Leah walked a step behind him and asked, softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "Do you think it'll still run?" Henry didn't stop walking when she asked the question. He just let the morning fill the space between them for a few seconds, the way a preacher might let silence settle before delivering the kind of answer that people remember years after the echo has died. And then, without turning, without so much as a shrug, he said the kind of thing that sticks with you not because it's loud, but because it's certain. "It'll run," he said, his voice low and calm, like a man recalling not a fact, but a truth lived too deeply to explain. Because some things weren't built to die, just to wait. Leah didn't say anything after that, not right away, but the look on her face said enough, a quiet blend of curiosity and disbelief, the kind folks get when something impossible is said so plainly it almost sounds ordinary. The office trailer, all aluminum siding and crooked steps, creaked as Henry climbed up and filled out the transfer forms with the kind of handwriting that doesn't chase time anymore, just flows steady like a river that knows its course. The clerk behind the desk, A younger man named Tom with a ball cap turned backwards and oil smudges on both sleeves, leaned in with a smirk, half amused and half respectful. The way you'd look at someone who reminds you of your grandfather, but still makes you double-check the keys. You sure about this one, sir? Tom asked, sliding the paperwork forward. We got plenty of clean rides out front that don't need a miracle to move. Henry looked up, held his gaze a moment, and said the kind of thing only a man with 1,000 regrets and one unshakable memory could say. I didn't come here looking for clean, he said, reaching for the old brass key the clerk had tossed aside like a museum piece. I came here looking for real. Tom blinked once, twice, then slowly nodded, something in his grin softening just enough to show a sliver of respect he didn't give out often. Henry stepped back out into the light, the key cool and familiar in his palm, its teeth worn just enough to feel like they'd been waiting to turn again. Liao followed him silently, clipboard forgotten, steps matching his without meaning to, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The truck still sat quiet in the corner of the lot, like it knew it was being watched, like it had waited patiently for this moment long enough to earn it. Henry walked up to it with the same quiet gravity a man might show at the grave of a friend he never stopped missing, slow, measured, respectful, and when he reached the driver's side door, he ran his hand across the cracked paint like you might stroke the mane of an old horse that once carried you through fire. The others gathered without meaning to. Tom leaned against the trailer, arms crossed. A few bidders paused mid-discussion. Even the auctioneer wandered close, drawn not by noise, but by the strange pull of something old stirring back to life. Henry climbed into the cab without struggle, though his bones groaned in protest, not from age, but from the weight of everything he hadn't yet said. Inside, the air smelled of dust, leather, and a time when radios had knobs, not screens, and with the sunlight cutting through the cracked windshield just so, he could almost see it the way it used to be. He placed the key into the ignition like a man unlocking a door to yesterday, closed his eyes for one long breath, and whispered something under it, not a prayer, not exactly, but something close. Then he turned it. There was a moment, a long one, where nothing happened but the sound of a dry cough from the engine, like a throat clearing after too many silent years. Then once more, this time slower. The third time, a sound rose up from under the hood, not smooth, not clean, but alive. It choked, sputtered, growled, and then, like the breath of a man long buried who's just remembered why he came back, it roared. Gasps escaped from the small crowd, not loud, but honest, because they'd seen something they didn't believe could happen, not anymore. Tom laughed softly, shaking his head. Well, I'll be damned. And from her place near the door, Leah asked the question everyone else was thinking but didn't know how to say. Why did it start for you? Henry didn't answer her right away. He just sat there behind the wheel as the engine idled beneath him, low and uneven like an old man's breath in the early hours of dawn, unsure whether to rise or fade, and outside the cab, nobody moved or spoke, as if something sacred had just passed between metal and memory. He looked out through the cracked windshield, his hands still resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just holding it the way a man holds the photograph of someone he used to love when no one's watching. It started, he said at last, his voice quiet but strong, because it knew I never stopped waiting for it. Leah tilted her head slightly, unsure whether he meant the truck or something larger, and Henry, sensing the question behind her silence, continued without looking at her, speaking more to the space between them than to her directly. Machines don't have souls, he said, but they carry the weight of the hands that built them, the men who rode them, and the moments lived inside them like dust caught between floorboards, silent, patient, and heavy with what's been lost. The engine hiccuped once, then settled into a low rhythm that almost resembled a heartbeat, not young, not healthy, but steady. Henry reached forward and turned off the ignition, letting the silence fall like a soft blanket across the crowd, which had grown now to a dozen or so, each person holding their breath like they were standing in a church, not a dusty auction yard. He opened the door slowly, the hinges squealing like they hadn't been moved in years, and stepped down with a stiffness that came not just from age, but from knowing too many goodbyes. Tom was the first to speak, his voice softer now, like he understood something had shifted but couldn't quite name it. Never seen one fire up like that, not after sitting so long, he said. What did you do to it? Henry gave a small smile, one side of his mouth lifting as he reached into the cab and pulled out a battered envelope, yellowed and soft at the edges, the kind that had been folded and unfolded so many times it had grown tired of being secret. He held it for a moment, then passed it to Leah without a word. She looked down at the handwriting, blocky, deliberate, and unmistakably young, and read the first few words aloud before stopping, caught by something in the ink, or maybe the weight of the paper itself. If you're reading this, it means you found her. Henry nodded slowly. That letter, he said, eyes on the truck again, was written by my boy, just before he left for somewhere no man ever comes back from the same. The crowd fell silent again, this time with something heavier than awe, respect, maybe, or sorrow, or that deep ache that comes when you're reminded of someone you lost without warning and never quite let go of. Henry reached back into the cab and pulled something else from the glove compartment, a small, leather-bound photo album, the corners worn, the cover faded to the same dust gray as the truck's peeling paint. He held it to his chest for a moment, thumb brushing over the edge like a man preparing to open a door that hadn't been touched in decades. He left that truck behind for me to find, Henry said, his voice quieter now, almost tender, and in that letter, he asked one thing: not to fix her, not to restore her, but to ride her, one last time, down the road we used to take to the lake. Leah looked at him, her clipboard now forgotten on the ground, and for the first time since the auction started, her voice had no business in it, only a kind of quiet understanding. Are you going to go? She asked, not as a question, but as a whisper of hope. Henry gave a small nod, then opened the album, revealing a single photo tucked behind a brittle plastic sleeve, a young man, grease on his jeans, smiling with pride next to a nearly identical truck. Sunlight catching the edge of his face like a promise that was never quite kept. I made him a promise, Henry said, voice cracking just once, and I aim to keep it before I forget why I ever made it in the first place. Just then, the unexpected happened. A small boy, no more than 7, wandered up from the road, his face smudged with dirt, dragging a toy truck behind him on a string. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, eyes wide, staring up at the old Ford like it was a spaceship from a bedtime story. He looked at Henry and asked the kind of question only a child could ask without fear. Is that your truck, mister? Henry looked at the boy standing there, shoes untied, jeans a little too short, and a toy truck trailing behind him like a memory that didn't know it was supposed to fade, and for a long, quiet moment, the old man didn't say a word. Just let his eyes rest on the child's face, as if searching for something he hadn't seen in decades. Then, with the kind of softness that only comes after a lifetime of hard truths and too few tender moments, he knelt slowly, every joint protesting like old floorboards in a farmhouse long abandoned, and met the boy's gaze without bending it. That truck, Henry said, voice low and warm, belonged to someone I loved a long time ago. A boy just about your age when he first crawled under the hood to hand me tools I didn't know I'd dropped. The boy tilted his head like children do when they're trying to understand something grown-ups carry too heavy for words, then looked at the Ford with new curiosity, as though it held not just stories, but answers. Is he gone now? The child asked, not out of sadness, but out of the innocent way kids assume everyone older than 15 has already vanished into history. Henry smiled, just barely, and nodded once. He's gone, he said, but not lost. Not as long as this truck remembers the roads we took together. That answer seemed to satisfy the boy, who simply said, okay, and turned to go, but then paused, turning back with one more question no one expected. Do you talk to him still? Henry stood slowly, the photo album still tucked under one arm, and looked past the crowd, past the auction yard, past the edge of Ridgeview itself, toward a place no road signs pointed to, but every man over 70 knows by instinct. I do, he said softly. And sometimes, if the wind's just right, I swear he answers. That answer landed differently among the gathered. Some smiled, some turned away, others folded their arms tighter, because what he said wasn't for them, not really. It was for anyone who ever stood in a room full of strangers and suddenly remembered the voice of someone long gone saying their name like it still mattered. Leah, standing off to the side, wiped her eye in that quiet, embarrassed way young folks do when emotion sneaks up on them without permission. And when she looked at Henry again, she saw not just an old man with a story, but a man still standing inside that story, refusing to close the book just yet. Tom, curious despite himself, took a step forward and motioned toward the envelope Henry had shown earlier. You said your son left that letter before he shipped out, Tom said. You mind if I ask, where did he go? Henry looked down at the keys still in his hand, fingers tracing the grooves like reading Braille on an old Bible, and then looked back at Tom, eyes clear now, sharp as a man remembering exactly where he was the moment everything changed. Afghanistan, he said. Special Forces. He volunteered when he didn't have to. Told me it was time to stop fixing engines and start saving lives. That landed heavy. There's a certain silence that falls when a soldier's name is spoken in the past tense. Not the kind filled with pity, but with that quiet ache of admiration and the sharp sting of unfinished conversations. Henry nodded slowly, almost to himself, then stepped around the truck and opened the passenger door, gently, like welcoming someone invisible into the seat beside him. He set the album there, buckled it in with the seatbelt that still clicked like it always had, and closed the door with care. He said, "If I ever found the truck," Henry murmured, half to Leah, half to the space beside him, "I should drive it back to the lake and talk to him like he never left." Leah's voice was barely above a breath when she asked the next question, a simple one, but heavy as lead. "Do you know the way?" Henry didn't answer Leah's question right away, because sometimes even a simple question like, "Do you know the way?" can carry the weight of everything you've ever tried not to forget. And for a man like Henry, the road to the lake wasn't just a place on a map. It was a trail paved with ghosts, laughter, promises, and that terrible silence that follows a folded flag. He stepped away from the truck, slow and deliberate, eyes fixed not on the road ahead, but on the space between memory and motion, as if something, or someone, was calling him back, not from the past, but from just out of sight. "I used to know every mile by heart," he said, voice almost swallowed by the rising breeze. From the cracked sign on Miller's Creek to the sycamore tree near the fence line that always leaned west come spring. He paused, the words catching like old nails in dry wood, then added with a quiet ache that even the young could hear beneath his steady tone. "But the mind's got its own way of rusting, just like a truck left too long in the rain." That's when another voice cut in, unexpected, familiar, and full of a kind of urgency you don't often hear in the calm air of an auction yard. "I know the road," said Tom, the young mechanic, stepping forward with grease still under his fingernails and something different in his eyes now. Not just curiosity, but the hard kind of knowledge that only comes when loss and memory intersect like cross-traffic at a blind corner. Everyone turned toward him, even Henry, surprised not by the offer, but by the conviction behind it, and Tom nodded slowly, once, like confirming a decision he'd already made long ago. "My brother and I used to take that same drive," Tom said, voice steady despite the knot forming in his throat. "Used to race our bikes out there every Sunday after church, said the lake was where we'd build our own dock one day. Just us and the dog, nothing else needed." Leah watched him now, something unreadable flickering in her eyes, and Henry studied the young man with the kind of long, thoughtful look that old men give when they recognize a reflection of their younger selves walking around in someone else's skin. "Your brother," Henry said slowly, "he didn't come back either, did he?" Tom didn't answer with words, just shook his head once, eyes focused on the Ford, the album still buckled in like a silent passenger waiting for the ignition. "We lost him overseas," Tom said finally, each word heavy, deliberate. "Same unit your boy was in 7th Group. Name was Luke." And just like that, something shifted in the stillness, not broken, not loud, but like the first crack in winter ice, soft and sure. Henry took a step toward Tom, then another, until the two men stood a breath apart, one old and weathered like a barn beam, the other young and worn too soon by grief, and Henry reached out a hand, not in comfort, but in understanding. They shook hands without a word, that quiet, hard kind of handshake that says more than speeches ever could, and for a moment, the difference in years between them collapsed into something timeless and shared. "Then maybe," Henry said, eyes shining just a little now, "we take this ride together for them, for us, for the one still waiting at the water's edge." Leah, moved in a way she hadn't expected, took a small step forward, but stopped herself, unsure whether to interrupt what was quickly becoming something sacred between two men bound by more than blood. Henry turned to her then, voice softer now, but no less sure. "You ever ride in a truck like this?" Leah didn't answer right away, and it wasn't because she didn't know or hadn't heard the question, but because sometimes the body remembers a truth faster than the tongue is ready to say it, and in that brief pause, you could almost hear the wind hold its breath. She looked at the truck first, then at the men standing beside it, and then down at her own hands, fingers still wrapped around a clipboard she hadn't written on in 20 minutes, as if trying to decide whether the weight she carried inside her chest was one she could share with strangers under a morning sky. Then, with a small step forward, the kind that doesn't look like much from the outside but feels like crossing a wide river inside your soul, She said the kind of thing that quiets even the birds overhead. I did, Leah said, her voice firm but trembled just a little at the edges, like a screen door in a summer breeze. Once, a long time ago, before I stopped calling it home. Henry and Tom both turned toward her now, not out of surprise exactly, but in that slow, attentive way folks do when something sacred is being unwrapped in front of them. She touched the hood of the truck lightly, her palm resting flat like she was reading Braille written in rust, and when she finally looked up, her eyes held something neither man expected to see: recognition. My father owned a truck just like this, she continued. Same year, same color, even the same cracked rearview mirror that always made him cuss on back roads. She gave a small laugh at the memory, though it came out more like a sigh, and her voice softened. I must have been no older than 6 the last time I sat in that cab, she said, eating orange slices while he drove us out to the lake, saying someday, that spot would be ours, just the two of us. No noise, no fighting, just water and quiet. Henry nodded, slow and steady, his face unreadable but his eyes beginning to glisten at the corners. Tom crossed his arms, jaw working slightly, as if chewing over something that hadn't yet settled in his heart. Leah, without waiting for permission, opened the passenger door and slid into the cab, moving slowly, reverently, as though stepping into a memory that had been left unfinished, and the moment she sat down, she closed her eyes, took a breath, and let it out like she hadn't breathed that freely in years. I remember the smell of the seat, she said quietly, like leather and heat and peppermint from the tin he always kept in the glove box. Then her voice dropped lower, a whisper barely meant to be heard, but clear in the quiet. He left one day and never came back, said he needed to clear his head, and I never saw the truck again. Henry's hand found the edge of the open door, his knuckles pale, his voice almost inaudible when he spoke. That lake holds more than water, he said. Seems like it's been holding pieces of all of us for far too long. Tom, after a long silence, looked over at Henry, then at Leah, and then turned his eyes toward the horizon, that wide, rolling line where land meets sky and stories find their final chapters. Then maybe, Tom said slowly, maybe that truck doesn't just belong to your son, or to her past, or even to this town. Henry turned toward him, curious, cautious. Tom's jaw tightened just slightly, and he added, maybe it's carrying something for all of us, something we weren't meant to leave behind. Leah opened her eyes, nodded once, and ran her fingers across the cracked dash like tracing a scar that finally stopped hurting. Then she asked, soft and steady, Henry, if we go to the lake, what exactly do you plan to do once we get there? Henry didn't speak at first after Leah asked what he planned to do at the lake, not because he didn't know, but because some answers carry a weight that makes them hard to lift, and when a man gets to a certain age, he learns that not every truth should be rushed, not even by time itself. He looked down at the gravel beneath his feet, then over at the open passenger door, where the sunlight poured in across the cracked dashboard like a blessing not asked for but deeply needed, and finally let out a breath that seemed to have been waiting 20 years to escape. I plan to open it, he said finally, voice low but clear, the second envelope, the one my boy left behind that I haven't dared to touch since the funeral. Tom raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised, while Leah turned in her seat, her fingers still resting lightly on the edge of the photo album like it might shift if she let go. Henry reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat, fingers slow and careful, and pulled out a smaller, thinner envelope, still sealed, its edges curled with time, and across the front, written in bold, careful print, were the words, "Only open at the lake." It's been 22 years, Henry said, looking at the paper as if it were alive, and I've kept this with me through everything: moves, storms, nights when I drank too much to sleep, and mornings I woke up forgetting what I'd been dreaming about. He turned it over once, then slid it back inside the coat as if even touching it for too long might cause it to crumble. He wrote the first letter before he left, Henry continued, but this one he gave to his squad mate just in case something went wrong over there, and it found its way to me through a chaplain 2 weeks after the flag came home folded. A hush fell again, deeper than before, as if the very air around them had stopped moving to hear the rest. Leah's eyes were damp now, though she didn't wipe them. She just watched Henry the way you might watch the ocean breathe from a quiet porch, steady, reverent, and ready. I've been scared of that envelope, Henry admitted, not because of what it might say, but because of what it might end, the questions, the hoping, the last piece of him I haven't let go of yet. Tom shifted his weight, crossing his arms tightly, and said quietly, but if he wanted it read out there, at the lake, maybe there's something in it that needs that place to make sense. Henry nodded, not quickly, but with the slow, patient agreement of a man who's finally run out of reasons to delay what needs doing. Then, just as he turned to start the truck, a sudden bark pierced the stillness, loud, sharp, familiar, and from the side gate of the auction yard came a shape Henry hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. A German shepherd, old and strong, with a coat that had faded at the muzzle and eyes that still sparked with fierce loyalty, bounded toward them with a kind of joy only dogs can carry. "Ralph?" Henry said, eyes wide, voice caught halfway between disbelief and laughter. "Ralph, is that you, boy?" The shepherd jumped once, tail sweeping the gravel, then sat right beside the truck as if he'd been waiting there all morning. Leah looked stunned, and Tom knelt instinctively, reaching out to pat the dog's side. Henry stepped closer, rubbing the old shepherd's neck with rough hands, and murmured, "He was with my son before he left, came back to me after the funeral, then one day, just vanished like the wind." Leah leaned out the window and asked, carefully, "You think he remembers where the lake is?" Henry smiled faintly when Leah asked if the dog remembered, and he crouched just enough to meet Ralph's eyes, those familiar, golden marbles that hadn't dimmed despite the years spent somewhere only the old dog knew. And he spoke with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from knowledge, but from a trust built slowly, moment by moment, between man and animal. "If anyone remembers that road," Henry said, rubbing the shepherd's thick neck with the reverence of someone touching holy ground, "it's this old soul right here. He's walked it in the rain, the heat, and the silence that came after." Ralph gave a soft bark, not loud, but firm, like punctuation at the end of a sacred sentence, then climbed into the truck's cab with the ease of a creature who already knew his place. Henry followed, slowly, the joints in his knees protesting the climb, but his face calm now, as though the weight he carried had shifted, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer pressing down quite so hard. Tom climbed into the back, sitting against the side panel of the bed, legs stretched out in front of him, hands braced for the bumps ahead, and Leah slid over in the bench seat beside Henry, folding her hands in her lap like someone preparing for church. Not a drive down an old country road. The engine coughed once as the key turned, then caught, rough, uneven, but willing, and with a slow press of Henry's boot against the pedal, the truck rumbled forward, tires cracking through gravel that hadn't felt tread in years. They pulled out of the auction yard in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because words, at that moment, would have felt like graffiti on stained glass. Out on the two-lane stretch past Ridgeview's edge, the road bent gently south, where fields opened like patchwork quilts sewn in drought and devotion, and the wind rushed past the windows in warm bursts, carrying scents of pine, diesel, and soil too long left alone. Leah broke the silence first, her voice quiet but steady, eyes fixed on the horizon where the road climbed gently between two distant ridges. "My father never told me why he picked that lake," she said. "He just said it was where peace lived." Henry nodded, not speaking yet, but his hand tightened ever so slightly on the wheel, a gesture small enough to miss, but telling enough to mark. Tom leaned forward from the truck bed, his voice raised just enough to carry through the open window. "We used to throw rocks off the old dock and see who could skip farther. Luke said if he died overseas, he wanted his ashes spread there, 'cause it was the only place his heart felt big enough to hold it all." Henry cleared his throat then, one hand moving to the inside pocket where the unopened envelope still waited, resting against his chest like a second heartbeat. "That lake wasn't always just a lake," he said, voice slower now, weighted with time, "not for me, not for any of us who carried something too heavy to set down anywhere else." Leah turned toward him slightly, one hand resting on the seat between them, close but not touching, her eyes searching his profile as if looking for the next page of a story he hadn't yet read aloud. "Was it always where you planned to go?" she asked. Henry took a long breath, the kind that gathers not just air, but memory. "No," he said, "not at first. I thought I'd bury it all, the letters, the photos, the grief, right beside the tools in my garage, where I could visit it without having to feel it." The truck rattled slightly as they passed a long-forgotten barn, its roof sunken, its door hanging off like a tired limb, and somewhere behind it, the land began to dip, hinting at the water that lay beyond. "But my son," Henry continued, "he knew better than I did. He knew that some promises can't be kept in silence, and some goodbyes have to be said out loud, even if the only one listening is the wind off the water." And then, just as the ridgeline gave way and the first shimmer of the lake came into view, wide, blue, and still, Ralph sat up straighter, ears pricked, tail thudding once against the seat like an old drum calling the faithful home. Leah leaned forward, her breath caught. "That's it," she whispered. "That's where it happened?" Henry didn't answer Leah's question right away, because when the past rises from beneath the surface, it's not just words that come, it's voices, shadows, echoes of 1,000 moments that refuse to stay buried. Even if the mind has tried to forget how they felt when they were still fresh and unfinished. The truck rolled to a slow, uneven stop beside the gravel pull-off at the lake's edge, that familiar crescent of worn shoreline where the grass faded into clay and the silence held its own kind of holiness, too vast to speak over, too personal to ignore. The air felt different there, not colder, not warmer, but thick with something unseen, as if the trees themselves remembered every footstep, every laughter, every goodbye ever spoken beneath their branches, and had been waiting for this moment to return it all in kind. Henry turned off the ignition and let the rumble fade, then sat for a moment longer, not moving, not speaking, just watching the lake shimmer in the afternoon light like a mirror held up to another time. Ralph jumped down first, landing with a grunt and a shake of his aging limbs, then trotted to the water's edge with a quiet urgency, tail low, ears back, as if he, too, knew what was about to happen. Leah followed, silent, her steps slow and measured, while Tom climbed out of the truck bed and joined them without a word, his eyes scanning the horizon like a man looking for something he'd lost a long time ago and finally remembered how to search for. Henry stood last, slower than the others, his hand gripping the door frame as he rose, not from weakness, but from the gravity of the moment pulling him down just enough to remind him it was real. He reached inside the coat, fingers closing once again around the envelope that had haunted him for 2 decades, the second letter, the last letter, the one that had waited for this place, for this silence, for this breath in time. They gathered near the stump of an old cedar tree, its bark half-peeled, its roots exposed, as though it too had grown tired of holding itself together after so many storms. Henry sat slowly on the stump, resting the envelope in his lap, his hands trembling now, not from fear, but from reverence, because once something is read, it can't be unread, and once the truth is named, it can no longer hide. "I never opened this," he said quietly, "because I thought it was for me alone, a goodbye only I was meant to carry." Tom nodded, standing behind him, arms crossed not in defiance, but in protection of this place, of this man, of what they were all about to hear. Leah sat on the ground nearby, knees drawn up, chin resting on her hand, watching Henry not as a stranger, but as someone who had led her back to something she hadn't known she needed to remember. Henry broke the seal. The paper inside was thin, brittle, written in blue ink that had faded slightly but held firm, as though the hand that wrote it had pressed harder than necessary, knowing it would have to survive more than just time. Henry cleared his throat, then began to read aloud, and the words, though soft, filled the space around them with a kind of power that made the trees stand still and the lake hold its breath. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back, and you found the truck like I hoped you would." His voice cracked, but he kept reading. "You were always trying to fix things, engines, fences, even me. But there was one thing you never got the chance to fix, and that's why I'm writing this now." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, puzzled, but he continued. "I met someone before I shipped out. Her name was Olivia. She didn't know I was leaving until it was too late, and I never got to tell her everything. But before I left, I asked her for one promise. If anything ever happened to me, she'd raise our daughter the way I wish I'd had the chance to." The world fell silent. Henry's hand trembled now, the paper rattling in the soft wind. "Her name is Leah, Dad. She's yours to find. And if you're reading this with her nearby, then somehow, you already did." Leah gasped, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with something deeper than tears, the kind of recognition that strikes all at once, like lightning splitting a quiet sky. Henry looked up slowly, eyes meeting hers, and the photo album fell open beside him, revealing the last picture of his son, young, laughing, grease on his knees, and standing beside him, just out of focus, a young woman with familiar eyes, barely visible, holding something small in her arms. Leah whispered, unable to finish the thought. Henry didn't speak either. He just reached forward, took her hand, and held it tight, not as a stranger, not as a friend, but as something he'd been searching for, even when he didn't know what he was missing. The wind blew gently off the lake, and in that stillness, with Ralph sitting watch, Tom standing guard, and the three of them together at last, something long broken began to mend. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. And so the truck, that old, rusted Ford, didn't just carry memory. It carried legacy, reunion, healing. In the quiet of Ridgeview Lake, Henry didn't just keep a promise. He found a granddaughter. And through her, his son lived on, not in silence, but in the sound of one last letter, read aloud beneath a whispering sky. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.